All right. We have hit the top of the hour. People are going to join us, but I will get us started so that we have the maximum amount of time available for discussion today. So, hello and welcome to today's event from the Council on Criminal Justice. I'm Stephanie Kennedy, the Policy Director here at the Council. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar exploring recent crime trends and how cities are responding to prevent violence and promote public safety. If this is your first time joining a Council on Criminal Justice event, welcome. The Council is a nonpartisan research and policy organization that builds consensus for data-driven solutions that enhance safety and justice. We are a think tank and invitational membership organization, and we are guided by the belief that a fair and effective justice system is vital to democracy and a core measure of our nation's well-being. That mission has driven our members and staff to take on some of the most pressing and high-profile issues in our field: the impact of COVID-19 on our criminal justice system, policing, community violence, and racial disparities and imprisonment, just to name a few. Today, we explore another high-profile issue in our field: the recent trends in crime, and especially violent crime, which are driving headlines across the country. We aim to examine what the data show and don't show, and learn how big cities and small towns are addressing violence and trying to create safer communities. In January, the Council published an analysis of data from 38 cities to examine how crime trends have changed over the past year and since 2019, before the start of the pandemic. This report was designed to inform the field and facilitate deliberations of our Crime Trends Working Group, a group of expert producers and consumers of criminal justice statistics, seeking to explore and explain current crime trends. The group also is generating proposals for improvements in the nation's capacity to produce timely, accurate, and complete crime data. You will hear from members of the group today. Before we begin, a few notes. To ensure a quality experience for everyone, all lines are muted, but we want to hear from you. Throughout today's session, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will take as many questions as possible at the end of today's session. If you're a member of the media, please identify your outlet and your question. If we don't have time for your question, you can email us. My colleague will put our contact information in the chat at the close of the hour. I also want to take a moment before we begin to remember our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Rosenfeld, who passed away last month. Rick was an eminent criminologist, a longtime professor and mentor of students at the University of Missouri at St. Louis, and a true leader in the field. Among his many other accomplishments, Rick was also the founding chair of the Crime Trends Working Group and the driving force behind CCJ's Crime Trends reports, which he co-authored. Most importantly, he was a wonderful human being. Our work on crime trends would not be where it is today without Rick, and we miss him dearly. And with that, I turn to Alex Piquero to kick us off. Alex is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Miami. Until recently, he was the director of the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics, and he was a member of CCJ's Violent Crime Working Group. He now serves as a senior advisor to the Crime Trends Working Group. Alex, take us away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on your lunch break or whatever coast you're in. While none of us will ever be able to replace Rick, and someone I've known for 30 years in my career, I do hope that all of us can continue the important work that he devoted his entire career to, and did so with a good heart, and for those of you who know him well, a good nature about him. Today's webinar on crime trends and what cities are doing about the crime problem is a topic near and dear to Rick's heart, and one that is front and center in terms of local and national conversation about public safety. Does crime go up or does crime go down? Is it local? Is it national? Does it vary by crime type? Does it vary by when you look at it? Months, years, weeks? Answers to these questions are critical because absent reliable, accurate, and timely data on crime and crime trends, policymakers will be making ill-informed decisions. We are fortunate to be joined by 4 esteemed members of the Council on Criminal Justice Crime Trends Working Group. To keep things moving along, we'll share full bios of our distinguished panelists in the chat. But quickly, I'd like to welcome the following 4 people. Ernesto Lopez, Research Specialist at CCJ. Dr. John Roman, Senior Fellow in the Economics, Justice, and Safety Department at NORC at the University of Chicago, where he also directs the Center on Public Safety and Justice and chair of the CCJ Crime Trends Working Group. Delreese Adams, Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. And finally, Thomas Apt, Founding Director of the Violence Reduction Center at the University of Maryland. Now I would like to turn to Ernesto to provide an overview of the year-end crime trends report that was released a few weeks ago to help ground us our conversation in data and get a clearer picture of what's happening in cities across the nation. Ernesto, up to you.
Thanks, Alex. Today, I'm going to highlight a few findings from our year-end crime trends report. Much of the focus has been on homicides, gun assaults, aggravated assaults, comparing change since 2019, the year before the pandemic, and widespread social unrest. The report was authored by myself and Bobby Boxerman. This study is the 12th in a series of reports for CCJ exploring crime trends patterns since the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic. It covers 12 offenses in 38 American cities from 2018 to 2023. I will discuss most of these in detail, but here are a few key findings from the report. Homicide, gun assaults, aggravated assaults continue to decline from their peaks in 2020 and 2021. Property crime patterns are more mixed. Some property crimes remain below 2019 levels or have returned to 2019 levels, while others are elevated. And lastly, drug offenses remain below pre-2020 levels. Next slide. This chart highlights 8 of the 12 offenses covered in our report. The teal blue bar shows changes in rates for specific offenses from 2019 to 2023, and the dark purple bar shows changes from the last full year, 2022 to 2023. I will cover homicide, aggravated assault, and gun assaults in more detail later on in the following slides, but it's worth noting here that all 3 of these offenses were higher in 2023 compared to 2019, and that they have declined during 2023. By the end of 2023, robberies in our samples cities were approximately where they were in 2019, after a slight increase in 2023. In contrast, carjacking, which is a form of robbery, was 93% higher in 2023 compared to 2019, but it dropped 5% in 2023. Carjacking data represents 10 cities, the smallest number of cities in our sample. Robbery incidents, which are widely available in sample cities, are widely available in our sample cities, but only a small set of cities provide details on robbery incidents, including things like commercial robbery and carjacking. Furthermore, when we think of carjacking in the context of robbery, carjackings make up about 10% of robberies in cities that provide carjacking information. And when we can then shift to other property crimes, such as larceny and shoplifting. From 2019 to 2020, larceny decreased during the emergence of the pandemic and associated restrictions. After this decrease, larceny started to recover to 2019 levels, but decreased by 4% during 2023 and remained 7% below 2019 rates. Shoplifting, which is a form of larceny, was 2% lower in 2023 than in 2019. However, shoplifting increased by 22% in 2023. While all of our data rely on people reporting crimes to the police, it's important to emphasize that in our report, shoplifting only covers reported shoplifting to law enforcement and does not include shoplifting figures from other organizations or entities. Last November, the council released a more detailed report on shoplifting. I encourage you to visit that report if you have not already. Lastly, motor vehicle theft has continued to rise since 2019 and increased 29% in 2023. While we first identified an increase in the summer of 2020, beginning in the summer of 2022 and continuing to 2023, we noticed a large climb in motor vehicle theft. The emergence of social media videos demonstrating how to steal certain Kia and Hyundai vehicles is a likely major contributor to this increase. Next slide. Before I highlight some of the findings in a recent homicide trends report, it's helpful to put homicide in some context in longer-term trends. The homicide rate peaked in 1980 at 10.2 homicides per 100,000 people. The rate eventually dropped to a low in 2014, the lowest point since at least 1960. Then in 2015, homicides began trending upward. From 2019 to 2020, homicide increased by 30%, the largest single increase since 1960. After a small increase in 2021, the rate decreased by 9% in 2022 to 6.3 homicides per 100,000 people. Next slide. Turning back to our report, we see the trend in recent years is similar to the national picture, with a jump in homicide from 2019 to 2020 and a smaller increase from 2021, followed by a decline. Across the 32 cities, the homicide rate was 18% higher in 2023 than 2019, but the rate fell by 10% from 2022 to 2023. Next slide. When we look at homicide trends by month, we see an upward cyclical pattern in the homicide rate over time. Looking at 2020, there is a dip in February and an upwards trend beginning shortly after then and peaking in July of 2020. The homicide levels in the summer of 2020 exceeded previous peaks during the study period amid COVID lockdowns and widespread social unrests after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police in May. There are still seasonal peaks and valleys in the homicide trends. But yet those peaks do not go above the summer of 2020, and there is a clear general upward shift in the trend. Next slide. Okay. Our report included several detailed analyses of homicide trends. One analysis looked at changes in homicide trends in cities with varying levels of homicide. Each of these groups experienced similar patterns, rising and falling over the past several years, but there are some important differences. Cities with the highest homicide rates prior to the pandemic, on average, did not experience the greatest increases in 2020 or 2021. Rather, it was cities with the lowest homicide average that saw the biggest increases, and they are still furthest from seeing the levels in 2019. Next slide. Here we see trends in aggravated and gun assaults. Like homicide, both offenses saw increases in 2020 and 2021, followed by a decline. Next, please. Across the sample of cities, the aggravated assault rate was 8% higher in 2023 than in 2019, but fell 3% from 2022 to 2023. Turning to gun assaults, the gun assault rate was 32% higher in 2023 compared to 2019, then fell 7% from 2022 to 2023. Next slide. In closing, I want to provide some final thoughts on violent crime trends. Homicide trends are encouraging, but homicide in 2019 was still relatively high compared to the prior period of 2007 to 2014. Homicide was already elevated in 2020 before the pandemic. Depending on the sample of cities, different studies found that homicide was about 25 to 30% higher in the first 2 months of 2020 compared to that same period in 2019. While homicide will likely decrease in 2024, it's unclear how much it may drop. There also appears to be more variation in homicide decreases than increases. As discussed in the presentation, cities with lower homicide numbers continue to experience higher rates. One of the more concerning findings is that gun assaults remain notably elevated. While they have declined and so have other violent offenses, they still remain stubbornly high. Lastly, achieving lasting reductions in violent crime requires addressing broader social drivers as well as initiating short-term prevention efforts. And that's it. Next slide.
Thanks, Ernesto. So you've been living with these data for 3 years, and so you've seen a lot of rows and columns, a lot of numbers and rates. And there's a lot here, but if there was one thing or maybe two things that you would want us and the audience to know that stood out in 23, what would be the takeaway if we had to tell people something about the 2023 numbers?
When I think of, when we've collected the data and working through it for a very long time, a lot longer than I thought we would. There are two really important trends that stick out, and one I added at I mentioned at the conclusion, and that is that gun assaults are still remarkably high. We are seeing some progress with homicides and aggravated assaults. And it's also important to contextualize that our sample of cities is smaller and understanding that relationship. But they are not dropping at the same pace that aggravated assaults and homicides are. So that's one observation. The other observation is that motor vehicle theft has continued to climb. When you look at the monthly trend, it does seem like towards the end of 2023, there's a drop, but it's still elevated, and it reverses a very long decline that we've seen since the 1990s.
So let me follow that up real quick, and then before we turn on to our next panelists, there are cities that were right at the beginning of the pandemic and maybe in 2019, but then, they had really high rates and then they've kind of fallen really sharply, right? We've seen St. Louis and Baltimore kind of go up, down in various types of crimes. Any sense of what could be driving things in certain cities to see those real sizable ups and then sizable downs?
Without a more detailed analysis, it's hard to say, but it is a fairly unique pattern, one that I wasn't expecting. And I think a plausible reason is that many of these cities have had higher homicide rates, have an infrastructure in place to deal with increasing crime rates. So I think that is a possibility that some of the cities with these lower homicide rates may not have that infrastructure in place. And so when that major increase, that these cities were able to address it, that other cities may not have had that problem before.
Well, that's great. So let me turn over to John. John is has been also studying crime rates and crime trends for a good part of his career. And John, you've been thinking about this report and Ernesto's findings for some time. One of the things that people talked about in the pandemic was something that happened in the height. The factors that may have caused the increase. And then as we get out of the pandemic, and now we're, somewhat post-pandemic, some of those factors are turning off, right? Or moving in a different direction, right? So if some things were causing or contributing to things to occur, then if we turn that off, those same things now cause those things to go down. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I think it's important in the context of what Ernesto just said and thinking about the effect of crime on cities to understand that part of what happens in cities are national trends exert a gravity on cities, and then cities have their own experiences in addition to that. So in terms of thinking about the national explanation for what happened between 2020 and 2023, there are really three leading theories that get a lot of credibility. There's still a lot of debate. There needs to be more analysis. I don't think there's a consensus. So there's the COVID pandemic story where you saw this dramatic change in the routine activities, particularly of young men who are at the highest risk of committing violence or being victimized, where they were home, away from pro-social institutions, proximate to other people where there were shared grievances and historical trauma. And that contributed a lot to the spike in violence. There's a story around the way police policed and how that changed in 2020, related in no small part to what happened with the protests. And there's a story there about an explanation about why that had a dramatic effect, particularly in the spring and summer of 2020, to increase violence across the country. And then between March of 2020 and today, there have been about 70 million additional firearms purchased for the first time in the United States. So and the rate at which people are buying and acquiring handguns is like 2.5 to 3 times what we saw just a couple of decades ago. So there's a lot more guns out there. Ernesto highlighted how much of this is about firearms violence. You and I have worked on some research together that shows that almost all of this increase in homicide is firearms violence. So those are the leading narratives.
So when all of us were, locked down in March, and then we were studying crime trends and crime rates in that, middle part to the end part of 2020 and into 2021, we were living in a time where we didn't have all of that data in real time, especially from some agencies which come out with data a year or maybe even 2 years thereafter. Do you have any sense right now, John, and now, thinking back, if you could have run that play last week, would you have made this, in the sense of which one of those might be, winning the race in terms of an explanation, and which ones might be, well, maybe not? You have anything you want to put out there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I should say, so I'm the chair of the Council of Criminal Justice Crime Trends Work Group. there is discussion and debate within the work group and across the field about the answer to your question. So I'm going to say it's just my reflections on this. I'll leave it to others to share their own. But I think that, the narrative around the protests seems to have lost a little bit of empirical support in a couple of ways. One is that, the pandemic's narrative is about something that happened everywhere, was all consuming, whereas the protests were really concentrated particularly in a few places, and where it was broad, it was in a very short period of time. And then with the 4 years worth of facts reflected in the crime data that Ernesto showed, that suggests that it was something bigger, more all-encompassing. Some data that Alex has shown me from the CDC suggests that something like 60% of the spike in firearms homicide occurs before March 25th, 2020, when George Floyd is killed. So that calls into question, the idea that the protests spurred the spike. The spike seems to be, have great momentum prior to that. The firearm story is really complicated, right? Because there's 70 million more firearms in civilian hands today than there were on March 2020. But the homicide rate is coming down. Ernesto shows that it hasn't quite come all the way back, but it's come most of the way back, even with an additional 70 million firearms. And that suggests that there are two separate marketplaces that we need to think about really differently: the civilian firearms market and the crime gun market, as very different phenomenon. We need to think about them distinctly.
I could talk about data and trends for another hour, but we can't do that because people don't want to hear me talk some more. So let's now shift the conversation into, we have the data and facts about the data, and let's move now into like what's happening at the ground level, quote unquote, in the real world. So I want to turn over to Delrice, who lives and breathes this stuff every day in the state of Illinois, to tell us what she sees there locally for the audience. Delrice.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Illinois, and particularly, I'll kind of start in Chicago, very similar to all of the data that has been described. Illinois doesn't look any different than the national trends. There has been an uptick in motor vehicle theft as well. We did, however, find in our data that the sort of narrative of that it's young people is a little bit different in Illinois. The age spans to a higher age limit is not, just young people that are involved in the motor vehicle theft. So lots of questions around what's causing that, what's driving that, and still speculation and much more data to collect around that. I will say much of what Ernesto described, our homicide trends are down about 13% from 22 to 23, but they were pretty elevated right after COVID. And it's, again, following the national trends in terms of what happened during the COVID time span. John mentioned the highest risk of participants, if you will, being more confined, not a lot of businesses and opportunity at hand. But I say something that we need more data on is the amount of resources that were available to people in terms of unemployment and some other safety net programs that were available during that time, where we know a lot of the violence is due to poverty, right? And crimes of opportunity. So I would say Illinois is very much following those types of crime trends that the report has brought out. I will also go a little bit further and say that we did a lot of reforms in 2019 that we were beginning to see some of the impact in the outcome, things about investment, really looking at the highest risk in terms of how we profile people as highest risk, whether they're shooters or highest risk at being victimized. And some of that work, we think we're beginning to still see the outcomes and the impacts of that, and having those resources available through COVID to really expand those strategies, specifically around like street outreach and community violence investments. We're beginning to see a decline in these years that are coming up, 22, 23, even though there was an increase post-COVID. So that's kind of what we're seeing in Illinois and Chicago.
So I have two kind of interrelated questions. So, I'm in Florida, you're in Illinois, very diverse states, big cities, small cities. They also have gun problems and they have public safety problems. you know, in your knowledge and you and your team, what barriers do you see other people on the ground who do this on a day in and day out basis? What barriers do you think they see with respect to the gun violence problem, as well as the array of public safety problems?
Yeah, so we've done a collective, a really comprehensive approach in Illinois across all levels of government, city, county, and state. We're actually working together to have a one table, one strategy alongside philanthropy and business, because what our data has shown, and it's a really important work has come out of the crime lab at the University of Chicago, is that we can identify and kind of pinpoint about 20,000 people that we would deem high risk. And then when you couple that with the access to firearms, and not just access to firearms, but to those kind of machine guns that really create a volatile effect when they're used, that's kind of what we're seeing on the streets. Like, how do we make sure that we deal with that highest risk population who is more prone to utilize a firearm as a conflict resolution, or to be a person that is more prone to be a victim to firearm because of where they live or the environment that they're embedded in. And so having people on the ground, we feel is very important, having those options and opportunities for that highest risk population, but then also having the resources that are necessary in those communities to address things like job and workforce training, health issues that people are having and dealing with, so that communities can really thrive more and that we can address the root causes of violence. So that's kind of what people on the ground. The other thing that, you know, policymakers, as well as, you know, folks like my shop, that we do a lot of the grant making, and we also have statistical data. Like, we understand that we have to be smart on laws. We have to be smart on gun laws, because again, the access is so detrimental. If we've heard stories of, there's a community gun where young people know they can get this gun at a mailbox on a corner in a specific community area and use that gun as a community weapon, right? Like, that is a severe problem, and there's no amount of programming that would really help eradicate the violence that happens if the access is so readily available. We've heard stories of young people saying, oh, we were walking across the park home and we found a gun, right? Like, there's just an enormous amount of firearm access to young people, and as we call them, the highest risk population.
So just real quick before because I have so many questions, but so, you know, it seems to me that a lot of your job is leveraging not just dollars, but leveraging people, which at the end of the day, you know, people are policy. They're the ones who actually get the work done. So you must spend a lot of time on the phone, on video calls. What's that like, to marshal all of these people together on a day in and day out basis?
Yeah, so we're doing some incredible work in Illinois. As I mentioned, we have a table, it's called the Government Alliance for Safer Communities. It is the highest ranking of the City of Chicago Mayor's Office Community Safety. It is president of Cook County, the Cook County Board's President's Office, Chief of Staff, as well as the Justice Advisory Council for Cook County. And it is the Illinois Department of Human Services Firearm Violence Prevention Office, as well as my office, which is the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. We literally meet weekly. We have a shared strategy. We're leveraging all of our resources. When the American Rescue Plan dollars came through, that was a huge opportunity for Illinois to invest in communities that have historically been disinvested. We collectively put over $400 million into violence prevention strategies. And so those meetings occur, we don't always agree, but again, we do come up with a collective goal of how do we reduce the homicides in Chicago. And we are, again, seeing that reduction. In 2019, we were around 500 homicides, and then 2020, 778. We're getting back around that 500 number. And of course, you know, that is too high, but those strategies we feel are really having impact. We know that there's much need, and we still need to scale up our community violence intervention so that we can meet that 20,000 number. Right now, we're probably able to serve maybe a third of that, if a little less. So just being very strategic, understanding where we need to target funds and strategies, what populations kind of need to be looked at and given resources and making sure that we're making those smart decisions with the
Well,
limited.
it's a perfect segue. Without planning, people in the audience, without planning, it's actually a really nice handoff because there's a game Sunday, I hear, into Thomas. And Thomas, of course, is the founder of the Violence Reduction Center, and has done a lot of work with lots of cities. And he's going to tell us a little bit about the work he's done throughout the US. So Thomas, to you.
Sorry about that. Years in of doing Zooms, I still forget to unmute myself. Apologies. So the VRC, also known as the Violence Reduction Center or Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction, has a pretty simple mission. It's to save lives by stopping violence using science. And we do that by doing research with an emphasis on research that's relevant to policymakers. And we do that working directly with policymakers at the local level to help them choose the right strategies to save lives. We're a new organization. We've been around for about 18 months, but we were working with 3 cities, Knoxville, Boston, and St. Louis. And in every city, we meet with local leaders in person, and we sort of brief them on the state of the science in terms of what works to reduce violence, especially in the short run, meaning 1 to 3 years. And there's about 6 to 8 strategies that I think the scientific community would sort of characterize as either promising or proven. And in each of these cities, we don't sort of micromanage this. We sort of let them customize their decisions to their own jurisdictions. But in each of these cities, they've come up with roughly similar approaches. And so each city has sort of chosen, number one, to focus on the highest risk people and places. This is very important, as Director Adams said, because this violence is so highly concentrated. And so identifying those concentrations and focusing on them and engaging both people and places and saying, violence will no longer be tolerated among these people and in these places. But also approaching this with a balance of empathy and accountability. All 3 cities have chosen to intervene with these highest risk people and individuals with CBT-informed services, cognitive behaviorally informed services. And this is also based on a lot of the work that came out of Chicago with Becoming a Man and Ready Chicago. But they're interested in not just engaging people and offering services, but offering clinical therapy that can actually help identify and change problematic thinking and behaviors. And the science says that this is one of the best ways to intervene with people who have been through a lifetime of trauma and really need extra help in changing their behavior. And then the last thing is that all 3 cities are using street outreach, folks who are from impacted communities who have credibility in these communities, not just to mediate disputes. That's something that we've heard that is often done, but importantly, to connect the most disconnected people to much needed services. And so that's extremely important. So those are some sort of 3 characteristics. And just stepping back, I would say a lot of this is consistent with, Alex, our work on the Violent Crime Working Group and the 10 essential steps that every city should take to reduce violence. We're very proud of that final report that we did, and it's been very influential. And in fact, just last month or 2 months ago, the Department of Justice incorporated those 10 steps into a DOJ roadmap on violent crime, both of which are in the links. So I'll leave it there for now.
All right, let me follow up just real quick, Thomas, with 1 or 2 questions for you, then, because the chat is like lots of stuff going in the chat with lots of questions, and I want to make sure that we get the questions for people. You're working with 3 very different cities. and all crime is local. How many of these things are transferable? Because everybody's going to say, oh, in my city it's this, and in my city it's this. So in your experience working with lots of different groups, how transferable are some of the things that work, and is everything transferable?
Sure. So it's interesting because the problem of community gun violence that's happening in community settings, looks very similar jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's always concentrated among a few individuals and groups. It's always concentrated among a few micro locations or hotspots. It's often driven by disputes that are not sort of directly connected to organized criminal activity. And it's often involving people who are a little bit older and a little bit more deeply involved in the criminal justice system than many people expected. That said, where you see endless variation is on the solution side, on the local capacity side. And so we in theory, all of the interventions that these three jurisdictions chose are transferable to other jurisdictions. But in practice, you really have to begin with an assessment of your own violence, understanding your problem people and problem places, and then mapping your assets. That's how those cities came to those particular strategies and not others. So yes, in theory, transferable, but everybody should start with their own problem analysis.
So let me just one real quick follow-up, Thomas. So what are the obstacles that cities that you've worked in maybe have been able to overcome, or maybe obstacles that have prevented cities from moving the needle?
Sure. Well, let me give you very quickly two political challenges and two capacity challenges. Starting with the large P political. As everyone knows, we're in a highly polarized era of criminal justice politics and policymaking. And so in jurisdiction after jurisdiction that we go in, depending on the political affiliation of stakeholders and leaders, they may be unwilling to embrace some types of anti-crime strategies, even if they're supported by sound science. We've seen jurisdictions which are very progressive that are reluctant to embrace enforcement-oriented strategies, even if they've been shown to work. And we've been to conservative jurisdictions that don't want to do services or treatment, even when we see that works. And so what we've seen is sometimes politics gets in the way with, the sort of progressive versus conservative conversation. The other political challenge is the small p political. And this goes to what Director Adams said about bringing folks together. A lot of political challenges at the local level have nothing to do with big national issues. They're personal. They go back, they can go back many years. They're local disputes over resources or and various things. And getting all of those players to work together is critical. As I always say, violence reduction is a team sport. And if the members of the team don't play well together, the team cannot be successful. In terms of capacity, one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of these strategies are pretty sophisticated. And if you want to do them well, you often need to bring in a national training and technical assistance provider who's done this in multiple jurisdictions, who understands all of the moving pieces to help you get a strong start. What we've seen is that there's only a few of those organizations, and they are extremely booked up right now. So we have a massive capacity challenge in terms of high quality training and technical assistance. And then the last thing is pretty mundane, and I think might be surprising, but it might, reflect what everybody is experiencing in their own jobs. A huge obstacle to effective violence reduction in many of these cities is just simple project management. Keeping all of these moving pieces moving forward, herding cats, getting everybody together. Sometimes the best laid plans, even if you have a, very evidence-informed, high-quality analysis and plan, if folks don't carry it out, if folks aren't willing to do the sort of everyday work to drive that plan forward, it can fail. So those are the two political and two capacity challenges that I see.
That's great. And leadership from the mayor's office all the way down, working together, as I've seen in Miami and in Dallas. So thank you very much. So a lot of questions. I've been been able to narrow them down into two things, two buckets, like people like to use word buckets. So the first big question I'm gonna go with to Ernesto and John to tag team the answer, and then the next two questions I'm gonna go to Thomas and Doris. For Ernesto and John. John, you threw out a really staggering figure: 70 million more firearms in existence in the U.S. that we know of since March 20. Stephanie at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wants to know, is there any reason why, or any theories or guesstimates as to why these many more guns are now on the streets in the last few years?
Yeah, so we know it's long been true when you look at the patterns of firearm purchases, that sort of the perception of an existential threat causes people to feel unsafe, and they buy firearms as a result. So you see this around, for instance, the Sandy Hook, Newtown, Connecticut, the school shooting. There was a huge spike in firearms purchases after that, and that may well have been a reflection of the thinking that firearms might be much more tightly regulated after an event like that, and people wanted to stock up. In 2020, what I think you're seeing is this just widespread existential threat. I think it goes to the credibility of the pandemic as a big explanation for why violence spikes in general, that people felt fearful, the unknown was overwhelming, the trauma was deep and longstanding and widespread. And so people bought a lot of firearms. It's also worth noting really quickly, a lot of states have loosened regulations about, what you have to do in order to get a firearm, who's allowed to carry own and carry a firearm, and where they're allowed to carry it. And that makes it more appealing for a lot of people to go and buy a gun and have it because it's useful and legal in more places. And then just huge marketing. We forget sometimes that firearms are just another commercial product like Coca-Cola or a car. There's a lot of media and marketing pressure to entice people to buy, and you put these factors together and you see this explosion.
Ernesto, what would you like to add about that?
I would repeat everything John Roman said. So no, I basically agree with that, and it's a question that's been on my mind. I've seen some emerging research that talks about maybe concerns with legitimacy, which would be kind of related in mostly that same vein of something existential, something outside of what people can really control. So I think that there's a possibility there as well, but there's also that concern, I think, to John Roman's point, that I can say John Roman because I used to John Button, our director for the project. That the whatever's driving crime could also be driving those gun purchases. That it's the same sort of thing, the same sort of possible behavior. So that's all I would really add to that.
Okay. Turn it over to Doris and Thomas. So, we work in both worlds, the data world and the real world, and then there's the political world. And so, we're in an election year. Public safety is top of mind for lots of people for good reasons and maybe bad reasons. The data say one thing, the trends say one thing, but some of the responses don't always meet with the data. How can we, all of us, help inform that discussion in a way that's measured and objective, based upon your collective experiences and what you hope for over the next 10 months or so as we hear the discourse?
Boy, that's a tough question. Director Adams, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
You can start.
Well, I think that being honest with the public about what we know and what we don't know is really important, and not sort of pushing a narrative or pushing a particular version of a story past what we know from the science. We know a lot about what's going on with crime and violence trends in the United States. We don't know everything, and I think being candid about that is helpful, and really sticking close to the evidence is important. The other thing I would say is, for everyday folks, is we got to keep it simple. We have to communicate in a clear, concise way about what we know and don't know about crime crime and justice. And, you know, as you said, I think we need to leave politics out of it when we can. That doesn't mean that if a political talking point is raised that is just not consistent with the evidence, that we ignore it. What it means is that we can refute that point without resorting to a political attack or something like that. It's harder than ever to get folks to trust sources of authority. So we just have to do our best to earn that trust by being neutral and giving high quality advice and information.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Thomas just said, and also add that we have to really look at violence through a public health lens. I think we skew away from that a little bit and try to go to, you know, what is the trend and strategy, right? Like workforce, was it at one point? There were a lot of dollars put in workforce. We need to always be looking at it of what are those social determinants? It's education, it's health, it's employment, and making sure that we have a comprehensive approach to looking at violence, which means a little bit of patience, right? We think that we can get, you know, to the end game in a year with all of our research and our strategies, but it didn't take us a year to get here. This is a culmination of decades and decades upon disinvestment, poverty, structural racism, all of those root causes. And so how do we peel back that? How do we peel back the layers? Some of the narrative that is happening in a political arena does not help our efforts. It is actually pushing us back a couple of years to some of the policies that we thought were great. We thought a lot of policies in the 80s and the 90s were going to make us safer, and we know today that they didn't. So as Thomas mentioned, how are we more responsible? How do we give ourselves time to see if these strategies work? How do we listen more and to community? Those closest to the harm have the solutions. So how do we bring in those impacted voices to be a part of the conversation and a part of what we do and what strategies we adapt that they see fit and need? And the last thing I would just add is that we always have narratives with our numbers, right? To your point, Alex, the data will say one thing and the research will say another, but when you talk on the ground to community, they don't measure their safety only by homicides. It's also measured by the number of youth programs they can go to, the number of senior efforts that are out there to help seniors get food and different things like that. They measure it by the number of grocery stores that are in their area where they're not in a food desert and people aren't making rash decisions because simply they're hungry and their nutrition is off, right? So those are the things that we need to do more in the research space, that we need to have those narratives where we have the research and the data showing one thing, but what is actually happening to people in real life and what are their stories and what kind of research do they want to highlight.
So this is great because I kind of want to do a lightning round. So what I've heard so far is there's short-term solutions, there's medium-term solutions, there's long-term solutions. As I've said, you know, to medium in my class and my students, you have a 15-year-old kid right now who might put a gun in his or her hand tonight. You have a 10-year-old kid who might do that in 5 years, and you have a 4-year-old kid who might do it in 10 years. So you got to be building now and then building for the future. But oftentimes policymakers say, I don't have the resources, or I only got a certain number of resources, or this is the only thing I can do. So all four of you are seasoned in this way, looking at data, advising policymakers and legislatures and high-level government officials. How do you balance the short-term, medium-term, and long-term when people just want to do one thing right now and move on to the next object that they have to fix? So let's go in reverse order. So let's have the director go, Thomas, Ernesto, and then John.
Yeah, I think it's leveraging all of those resources, Alex. Some things live in different places, right? I'm a criminal justice authority. I don't have to fund workforce development if the economic development agency in the state is doing it. How do we get all of these cross sectors together? Community colleges, hospitals, everyone has resources and are touching the same people. And how do we do a better job of coordination and collaboration so that we don't have to have that conversation and we can sustain those types of strategies that we know are effective. So I just say more continued intersection of work, collaboration, and leveraging all of the resources so that we're getting to the root cause. There's a lot of waste, right? There's a lot of programming that goes to, maybe some things that are hopeful, but not are really going to get us the outcomes that we're trying to receive.
Sorry about that. So I think that there's really, sort of two speeds. You said sort of, short, middle, and long term. I really think about them in terms of sort of micro and macro. At the macro level, we have to invest in our country being a more fair, more just, more equal place for everyone, and to address the structural factors that put people in desperate situations every day, and not surprisingly, ultimately make desperate decisions. That is a long-term challenge that, if we're lucky, will be partially addressed in our lifetimes. It's a generational struggle that we all need to be devoted to, but we also need to recognize that it is a generational struggle. At the same time, we do need to have an intense sense of urgency about high levels of violence, crisis levels of violence in our most impacted communities across the country, and understand that high rates of violence are impacting everything else and impacting our abilities to get those broader social justice outcomes that we want. If you want better education in our most impacted communities, if you want improved health, if you want increased housing, if you want more economic opportunity, one of the first things you must do is provide some baseline level of safety. Because if you do not do that, these communities will continue to struggle. So I think the key is to keep two important things in your mind at the same time, which is the need for long-term concerted action and the need for intensive, or macro action, and then intensive micro action to provide immediate relief.
I'll build on what to Thomas's response, and I'll say I have read Bleeding Out twice. The first time I read it, I didn't care for it. But then as I've worked through and I've got to learn the data and learn what really works, I think it's a great book for practitioners and a model. And I say that because when I think of crime and crime prevention, there is that immediate need that has to be done. Because when we think of crime in a very academic sense, it tends to be big structural changes, and we can tend to forget maybe sometimes some of these more important measures. And I preface that by saying, while there needs to be a long-term investment, I also think there needs to be a focus on motivation of really understanding why people commit crimes. If we're talking about jobs, that a job is a way to get sort of social status, but so is looking tough on a street. And it's not just, putting someone to work in fast food. Are they going to feel fulfilled doing that? So I think there needs to be also focus on that cognitive behavioral therapy of really understanding that there's more ways to build credibility, to build respect with your friends and peers and neighborhood, aside from just carrying a gun, but also being a pro-social and positive influence on your community.
I mean, I should start by saying Bleeding Out is great every time you read it. So we need to start there. I think we all agree.
I was young and naive.
So it's hard to go last. But so I wrote a piece last year that was 100 things that can be done to reduce crime that are evidence-based, that have nothing to do with the criminal justice system. There's just a laundry list of things that we can do, and we don't think about doing a lot of these things as being crime reduction activities, especially when we think about how to keep the 4-year-old from becoming the 10-year-old, becoming the 15-year-old with a gun in their hands. One thing I would put at the top of that list would be stuff around victims. We don't talk enough about keeping victims from being repeatedly victimized. Del Reese talked about community colleges. I love that. The community college population in the United States is declining rapidly. We had a huge government support program. We took that away. This is targeting exactly the kind of age group and demographic of people who are at the highest risk of being victims or committing a violent offense. That's where we need to be investing. That is shown to reduce crime and violence outcomes. I think we also need to think about separating people from places and try and work on both. We talked a lot about how to work with at-risk people. We don't talk enough about in this country about how to work at-risk places, to really invest in them in ways where the outcomes are more about. I love what Delree said about how your sense of safety isn't just about what the crime rate is, it's about how many opportunities you have there. And thinking about places as foundations for investments, for making people feel safer and be safer and have opportunities, is a surest path to reducing crime. And then the last thing I would just say is, somebody asked in the Q&A, what would you invest in where would you start if you could invest in one thing? I would invest in something that has a return on investment, that creates enough social gain that we can invest in that again and something else. And like I said, if you start thinking beyond just the crime and justice lens to all of human services, to teachers, to libraries, to social workers, to community colleges, et cetera, you've got a vast array of things that, if we invested more in child poverty tax credit, would generate a return on that investment that would be sufficient to fund all kinds of other things that we want to do, to begin to invest in Thomas and the work that he does doing TA to help communities implement evidence-based violence reduction practices. So there's a lot of opportunity there. We just have to broaden the lens and get away from the other thing Thomas said about being too ideological and how we think about what appropriate solutions can and should be.
There's nothing better than being in a room, well, a virtual room full of really smart people. So we have very little time left, but since I'm the moderator, I can use the last few minutes. Lots of things keep all of us up at night. The people who are on this call, people working in this call. And one of the things I worry about is the discussion again about, let's get tougher on crime. Let's revert some of the changes we've done. So hopefully the data that we use here and the work that the evidence shows can move the needle back in a direction that we're making justice informed and evidence-based and evidence-informed, as Thomas likes to say, policy decisions. So I'll turn it back over to Stephanie for her closing comments.
Thank you so much to you, Alex, and to our really fantastic panel. I think this was a great conversation and really stimulated the way that we're thinking about crime and connecting it to actual people's lives. So not just looking at numbers, data, and charts, but really thinking about how we can help children and families, how we can help people in all of our communities and make our communities safer and happier and more full of health and wellness. If we had a lot of questions come through in the Q&A, and we're very grateful for them all. We tried to weave some of them in. If we weren't able to answer your question, please feel free to email us. My colleague's going to drop that link into the chat right now. We'd be happy to follow up with your question and get it to the appropriate person to answer it. Yeah, and thank you so much for everything. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us here at the Council on Criminal Justice.